I'm Pat Zerke. I'm the director of the forum, and I am delighted to welcome you here on this chilly night as we host Professor Timothy H. Green talking about a topic that just won't go away: state sovereignty, states' rights from 1789.
I'm J.L. Bell. I write about the American Revolution, and I'll be your moderator for this program. In 1789, George Washington returned to Massachusetts for the first time since 1776 as part of his tour of all the states that had adopted the Constitution and had elected him president of those new United States. Most places welcomed Washington with pomp and ceremony, including Boston, which organized a grand parade. Yet during that triumphal visit, Washington found himself at odds with his old colleague John Hancock, the oft-elected governor of Massachusetts. Who was the higher authority, the governor of the state or this new chief executive for this new federal union? What did the arrangement that those two statesmen worked out mean for the conflicts over states' rights that persist till today? Our speaker tonight, T.H. Breen, is the William Smith Mason Professor of History Emeritus at Northwestern University and now a James Marsh Professor at Large at the University of Vermont. Please welcome to Cambridge Forum, T.H. Breen.
Let me say that this lecture, this discussion, comes from this new book. I've spent a lot of time with George Washington over the last few years, and as I told someone at dinner, the more I was with George, the more I admired him. He's one of the founding fathers that wears very well over time. And the George Washington that I depict in my study is one that many of you won't find familiar. This George Washington is a man of extraordinary political vision, a gifted political innovator, a person who understood as powerfully as any of the subsequent presidents of the United States that our government is based ultimately on the will of the people. And during the first years of his presidency, even during the first months in office, this diffident, socially awkward man opened the door to a level of popular participation in political culture of the time that no one would have predicted from his background as an elite Virginia planter. He invited people who could not vote, women as well as men, poorer Americans, Northerners as well as Southerners, to give voice to their thoughts about the future of the country through a vehicle that we now know as public opinion. And so at the very start of our nation's history, Washington devised a plan to bring the federal government directly to the people that still shapes our expectations of the political process. And in 1789, Washington decided entirely on his own to take a journey to a new nation. Now, without prodding from his more celebrated colleagues, one thinks of Adams, Madison, Jay, Hamilton, the President of the United States came to appreciate, perhaps more than they did, that a person who owed his office to the people, whose very claim to authority derived from the people, had in some way to make himself accessible to the people. That is a challenge that lay at the heart of the new Republican government. It was this insight, this sense of responsibility, that compelled Washington literally to take to the road. Between the year 1789 and 1791, Washington organized several journeys which carried him to all of the original states. The travel by coach on back roads, dusty roads, rocky roads, watery roads, covered several thousands of miles. And on at least two occasions that I cannot describe in detail tonight, involved potentially fatal accidents. But in the fall of the year 1789, Washington decided to visit New England, then a region of the country which, despite its revolutionary heritage, harbored serious doubts about the prerogatives of the new federal government. What drove Washington at that moment was his sense that even after the ratification of the Constitution, the nation still was in a state of crisis. He understood that the threads that bound American people to a single shared political identity in 1789 were extremely fragile and untested. Washington, even more than some of his more celebrated colleagues, sensed just how much the new government of the United States was an experiment, and he was painfully aware that he operated on uncertain political terrain. Every act he made in those first days, those first months, involved establishing a precedent, a constraint on future presidents. In 1790, in January, in an unusually reflective letter to Catherine Macaulay, who was a celebrated London historian and author, she wrote a book called The History of England. And Washington, in this letter to her, confessed, "The establishment of our new government seemed to be the last great experiment for promoting human happiness by creating a reasonable compact in civil society." And he continued, "Few who are not philosophical spectators can realize the difficulty and the delicate part which a man in my situation has to act. In a word," said Washington, "in our progress toward political happiness, my station is new. And if I may use the expression, I walk on untrodden ground." And so he did. And so he did. The success, the survival of the federal government was by no means assured when Washington assumed the presidency. He knew very strongly what other revolutionary leaders, Mandela, Gandhi, over the years have had to learn, and that is revolutions do not succeed when the last shot is fired, but when a new government reaches stability that protects the principles of that original revolutionary cause. And certainly the new federal government, the ratification of the Constitution, had not reached the emotional ties of the ordinary people yet. If you lived in Georgia or New Hampshire, very few people had actually read the document that formed our new republic. And when Washington took office then in 1789, the political horizons of most Americans were intensely local, seldom extending beyond the borders of their own states. And so by taking the federal government to the people, Washington not only enhanced the legitimacy of a strong central government, but also helped ordinary Americans to comprehend that the United States was more than a sum of its parts, that it had to be more than a sum of its parts. So what, may we ask, was the trigger, the actual source of the decision to take this tour? The answer, of course, was that Washington still believed that the revolution had not yielded a government capable of responding to the needs of an ambitious republic. And if you ask him, he knew who was to blame. In his estimation, over and over in his correspondence, the problem with America was the states, centers of the worst parochial politics, states where demagogues build up factions that threaten the stability of the entire United States. I read George Washington. My opinion is that there is more wickedness than ignorance in the conduct of the states. In other words, in the conduct of those who have too much influence in the fabrication of our laws, end quote. Repeatedly, even when he was most disturbed by the direction of the nation, Washington, to his credit, never lost faith in the people. If the people only knew the truth, if they realized what these demagogues in the states were up to, Then they could break out of that spell that imprisoned them in their political ignorance, and together they would realize the nation's full potential. And the message he brought to the people was that a strong central government would bring individual citizens greater military security from predatory imperial powers, a greater chance for properly developing the immense physical and natural resources that this continent had to offer, and a greater ability to protect their rights from the states who were all too eager to trample on individual rights in the name of some local interest. So Washington, with this in mind, confronted his greatest challenge in the state of Massachusetts in the autumn of 1789. It was here that he brought to the full test his advocacy of a strong central union, and the enemy was none other than the governor of Massachusetts, John Hancock. The John Hancock of famed revolutionary resistance to British taxation, and of course, a man with a very large signature. The Hancock who was so vain that he really thought that he would be appointed the head of the Continental Army before George Washington. The Hancock who, as governor of Massachusetts, championed a form of sort of Mayor Daley populism, which, if nothing else, returned him over and over to office. Although Washington was discreet in such matters, he regarded Hancock as a bombastic, self-important demagogue. And with him, James Madison agreed. In a letter written just before Washington set out, Madison told Jefferson, "I'll tell you, Hancock is a weak, ambitious courtier of popularity, and I think given to low intrigue." But worse than these character flaws, Hancock put the interest of the state, in this case Massachusetts, before the needs and the possibilities of a new federal government. And for Washington, at that moment, in the fall of 1789, that was an unacceptable position. It was as unacceptable as it would be for Abraham Lincoln or Dwight D. Eisenhower in later crises when they confronted states that got out of control. Now, the entire episode took a kind of bizarre Gilbert and Sullivan quality, but for Washington, Hancock's behavior was not a source of humor. The curious confrontation began just a few days before Washington arrived in Boston. He was in the area of Worcester. And while traveling, Washington received an innocuous invitation from Hancock. "I beg the favor of you making my house the place of your residence while you remain in Boston." And more, Hancock ordered on his own authority a vast military escort, 800 men, under the command of a revolutionary hero, General John Brooks. Now, although the wording was congenial, the invitation suggested to Washington already that Hancock was scheming. He certainly wanted, or so it seemed, to take control, the choreography of the entire visit. Washington gently tried to distance himself from Hancock. First, as he had made clear to anybody who would bother to listen, he had no intention of ever staying at the home of a private citizen. He was the President of the United States, not the favored leader of this or that political group. And in any case, he knew that as soon as he stayed in the home of some over-eager subject, that person would assume political power. And so Washington stayed in taverns and inns, in private homes that he paid rent for. Hancock should have known this. After all, Washington had his press secretary announce before he left New York, which was then the capital, that he intended to make a private visit to Boston in the course of a week, and that he expressed a desire there not be any special celebrations on this occasion. That, of course, was very naive of Washington. The people were going to celebrate his visit in their own way, whatever he said or not. The problem with Brooks was more serious because the governor had called out the troops, not the President of the United States. And only because Washington was a dear friend of Brooks did he go through the official review, knowing that Hancock was behind it. And so he came to Boston, to the Causeway, the Neck, and there Washington found on a cold October day, it was wet and nasty, the road was blocked. And it was blocked because Hancock's allies were having a fight with the town leaders of Boston, and would not let the president through to the city, and they waited some hour. Finally, Washington made it to Boston, and they celebrated, I wish I could tell you more, one of the greatest parades in the history of the United States. It was terrific, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Hancock. At the end of the parade, Washington went to the house he had rented, and he waited for the governor to appear. He waited. He waited. And at the last moment, he received a note from Hancock urging Washington to come to his house, Hancock's house, for dinner because there was such a large party there, and he would like to introduce the president to his dear friends. As Samuel Breck, who was a young boy who kept a terrific diary at this time, was a witness to this dinner party diplomacy, then I read from his diary. Great importance was attached by Governor Hancock to the importance of state sovereignty, and he carried his notions of state independence so far as to expect Washington, our chief magistrate of the Union, should pay him, the governor, the first visit. But that great man knew what was due to his high station, and instead of going to the governor's house, went to his own lodging to wait. Now, several of Hancock's allies, among them Samuel Adams, knew that there was trouble brewing, and they went over to Washington's and had a little light supper. It must have been one of the most tense dinners you can imagine. They excused the absence of Hancock because they said Hancock had had a sudden attack of the gout. Now, this was well known to people that had followed the governor. He had bouts of gout usually when there was a crisis or a decision he didn't want to make. In fact, in Boston, it was called a case of, and I quote, dramatic gout. In blunt language, Washington explained to Samuel Adams and to the others, and I quote from Washington's mandate, I informed them in explicit terms that I should not see the governor unless it was at my own lodgings. And he added caustically that if the governor's gout was so serious, then it was indeed strange he was holding a large dinner party with all his friends in another building. Now, some of you may say that the president's comments may sound petty, perhaps a person that's a little overly sensitive to his own dignity. But I think that interpretation would be wrong. It would involve a profound misunderstanding of Washington's uncompromising belief that the federal government trumped the rights of a state. In the Union created by the Constitution, state governors paid the first visit to the President of the United States, not the other way around, and that was that. The next day, Hancock rethought the situation and sent a note to Washington that he now, and I quote, consented to go to Washington's lodging and pay him a visit. Washington generously accepted the offer, and he noted, Washington, in his diary for the day, the 25th of October, I received a visit from the governor who assured me that illness alone had prevented him from coming yesterday, and he was still somewhat indisposed, but as it had been suggested that he was expected to visit the president, there's a lot of passive verbs here, which he knew improper, he resolved to take all hazards to go out today and visit the president. But Hancock did everything with his own special flair. He appeared at Washington's door wrapped from head to toe in red, bright crimson woolen blankets, carried by 4 porters, so that one of Washington's aides said he looked like a Turkish pasha coming to make amends for the lost dinner. But Washington was not fooled by this pathetic stand down. There was no need to continue the sparring. The president had won the match. For the moment, in Massachusetts at least, the Union prevailed. I know that because the governor of New Hampshire was watching this whole developing situation, quite embarrassed. And when Washington moved out of Boston up towards New Hampshire a week later, the governor of New Hampshire stood at the border of the states, ready to welcome Washington the second he stepped on his state's land. But what probably ultimately persuaded Hancock to accede to Washington's authority was not a sudden change of heart, but rather an overwhelming sense that the people, the ordinary people, the people that marched in this terrific parade, supported the new president and the new Union. As one commentator explained in the Boston newspaper, the governor finally waited upon the president. The popularity of the president seemed to bear down everything like a torrent. And there you have it. The popularity of Washington at that moment bore down everything like a torrent by making himself accessible, by participating so fully in a new, open, seemingly egalitarian politics out of doors, that just the people. Washington eroded some of the local divisive loyalties that had doomed the nation's former government called the Confederation. One final image of this dinner party farce comes to mind. Again, the diary of this young boy, Samuel Breck, was actually written this some years later, but he remembered. The parade was over. Washington had gone to his rented house, probably asleep. He went to bed very early, rose early. It was dark. And the young boy is with a French officer from a visiting French warship. And as the two men passed the house where Washington was staying, the Frenchman told the young boy, or this is what is in the diary, all was quiet around it, no guards, no noise, no parade of visitors, whatever. Ah, said the French captain, this is the residence of the chief magistrate of your nation, reposing in confidence in the midst of his fellow citizens and protected by their love. A defense infinitely better than bayonets. In my country, said the captain, the smallest general would have had this house surrounded by guards, but not Washington. Washington's first journey to our new nation brilliantly alerted many ordinary people to the extraordinary prospects that were before them. Their prospects as citizens and residents in a new federal republic founded on a constitution that they themselves had ratified by their votes, but also ratified by standing in the rain for 6 hours in Boston to celebrate the man that had come to symbolize a new order. Unlike Hancock, Washington instructed them that if they would just see beyond the narrow horizons of their own separate states, they could snatch the prize of greatness. Of course, it was a very hard sell. In 1815, the New England states contemplated secession when they disagreed with the policies of the national government. In 1860, the southern states took up the cause of southern sovereignty. Others, even more recently, have questioned the value of a strong central government based on the will of the people. They have every right to advocate their beliefs, of course. But what they cannot do is claim that President George Washington was a supporter of such ideas. Thank you.
Professor Breen, you mentioned obviously Hancock's reception, the New Hampshire governor's response to that. What other responses did Washington have in his tour of the northern and then the southern states?
Well, it varied very much. There were 3 segments of the grand tour. One, the first from Mount Vernon when he accepted the presidency, and he went to his inauguration in New York, and then that fall to New England, and then after a year when the capital of the United States moved to Philadelphia, he took the longest and most arduous tour all the way to Savannah and Augusta, Georgia, and then back through the backcountry, 1,800 miles on roads that a 4-wheel drive couldn't negotiate today. His reception varied from place to place. In Hartford, he got a very warm reception, and he tried to promote, as a president would, a new woolen mill because he thought that the strength, this will surprise the audience, that the strength of America was to promote its own manufacturing, and that if jobs stayed in America, the country would be stronger. And so he used this as a photo opportunity, so to speak, to give a plug to the Hartford woolen mill. Later in the New England tour, Washington went to a struggling synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, the Touro Synagogue, which if any of you haven't been there, you should. It's just a splendid, moving building. And there, Washington gave what I believe was the most splendid talk he ever gave in his entire life, including the military years. And he explained to this struggling Jewish community what religious toleration meant in the new republic. And it was a daring speech. He pointed out something that I think most of us don't think about too closely. The head of the Jewish synagogue said that he hoped that Washington would tolerate Jews in the country. And Washington came back and he said, as president of the United States, I don't tolerate you. You have rights as just because you were born to pray as you will. It's not a gift from the government to say we tolerate you. My job is to protect your basic religious rights. They're there. I'm the protector. That's very important. So this New England tour may have had this tense moment with Hancock, but by and large, it opened the door to a diverse sense of broad prosperity that Americans might share in the coming years.
Were there precedents in British culture, American culture, for a president or a presidential tour like this? How did people understand the arrival of President Washington in their hometowns?
Any of you who studied basic European history probably came across the Queen Elizabeth especially, she was really good at it, had what they called progresses. And the Queen would get 60 or 70 of her retainers, and they would drop in, as it were, at a castle. They were invited, but they didn't sign any visa stubs either, and rather beggared their hosts. Washington knew about this precedent, and he insisted, as I already indicated in my remarks, that he would stay only at public inns, taverns, ordinaries, whatever you called them, because that's what a Republican leader did. He did not beggar his host or give them special privilege. He stayed in the local tavern. Now, that was the public Washington. In my research for the book, I found the private Washington kept a diary that reads like a guide to restaurants to avoid. He complained bitterly about noises, mosquitoes, bad food, unclean you name it. But he was a brave man, and he, especially through the South, where there was not, shall we say, a developed infrastructure of hotels, he had some very, very rough nights.
Here at First Parish, we look out on the Cambridge Common, which is where Washington met General Brooks and those 800 militiamen. I've read in a letter that he refused to review the militiamen as a commanding officer. And what did that say about his view of himself as President and Commander-in-Chief of the U.S.?
The moment, probably several hundred yards from when he was confronted with Brooks's, the state of Massachusetts militia, was very, very hard, because I say Brooks was a friend and an honored veteran. And so what Washington basically did was appear, rather than try to take charge as the president and assume command at that moment. It was part of the whole drama with Hancock, as I indicated. And as far as I know, Hancock was a very weaselly character, was able to revive his power. I don't know if some of you know, but he had a way of making a timely gift that would win votes, like a new fire engine for Boston, paid for by the government, that kind of thing. So both men went their separate ways. I might indicate to you that there was another person that got under Washington's skin in another part of the country and had similar crossings of swords, and that was Patrick Henry, who was another individual who could never see beyond the boundaries of his own desire, and was not supportive of the new central government.
Dr. Breen, I was just wondering, how do you go about approaching a founding father, especially someone with such, magnitude as George Washington?
Yes, the question about how do you approach the founding fathers, I would say, as an aside, I take it all of you have only bought 2 or 3 of my books in your homes, but most of my work has been about the founding people, about ordinary folks that came to Bunker Hill and protested and resisted, and without the founding people there wouldn't have been any revolution. We know that, but in fact all the books in the libraries about the founding fathers, and you'd think that it was a small literary group at a university that managed to get the whole revolution going. It was more than that. But that said, when you read the papers of a man like Washington, you try to gain an imaginative measure of his character. Frankly, I know this sounds probably a little superficial, but whether you feel comfortable in his presence. And I did, as I said, I grew very strong. My wife and I traced on the back roads of America the entire journey. We did. We followed the route, and using his diary as a guide. So all I can say as a historian, being factually accurate as I can be, there was a sense of trust that I had in the subject I was writing about.
Would you say that that precedent has continued throughout the presidencies in terms of staying in private homes versus in public conveyances?
Could you give me a little more here? I don't quite get it.
Well, when they go visiting,
Yes.
do you think that his precedence has been maintained with any evidence of other presidents following the
Yes.
same decorum?
Well, I think, let me see if I can wrestle. What Washington did was establish a precedent, that's what he was writing to that woman in England about, of the need to get out of the Capitol and be seen and deal with the people. Some presidents have been more at ease and more successful. Some have made a hash of it, frankly. But soon after, President Monroe did almost a copy tour of America because he realized, or his own memory of how successfully Washington had handled this. And so I think now all of our presidents, increasingly, however, there become media events, and probably my feeling is that Washington really did, when he was in the streets of Boston, have a much more intimate contact with the folks that were there. I mean, he was not a backslapping kind of guy, but he was accessible. So in the sense that in our government, it would be no longer acceptable to just lock yourself in the White House and never come out, however much some of our presidents might have desired such a role.
And these days, the security bubble that surrounds the president changed.
Yeah.
What you remarked about
Yeah.
Washington in his inn without anybody bothering him outside.
Well, that's I go to the next question, but this is something that's truly amazing. The entire tour of Washington was a coach and a baggage wagon, several servants, a secretary, a driver of the coach, and that was it. As far as I know, there were no arms, no guns. He just simply took the presidency to the people. Now that, following up the previous man's question, that of course would not happen today.
I'm a retired architect, and I have heard that the temporary arch that was built on Washington Street was the first great construction by Charles Bulfinch, and there's a rendering of it at the Mass Historical Society now that I had never seen before. But can you say anything about that, or the Great Parade that?
Well, if I started on the parade, you wouldn't go home tonight. But in front of the State House, this Bulfinch, the questioner is quite right. This was one of his first commissions, a public commission. He was very, very happy to have it. And it was a complicated piece of temporary, like World's Fair temporary architecture of 3 arches, 2 smaller ones and a large one. And the parade went through the large arch. There were stars and slogans all over it about remembering Washington when he was the general that saved Boston from British oppression, about the French who had been our allies, and so on. It was quite an elaborate thing. Then there was, at the State House, an equally bizarre rendition of Circe, the goddess of the harvest and various other things. And that was done by another architect in Boston that people don't remember, by the name of Dawes. And he worked quite closely with Bulfinch. My favorite story, however, comes from a judge, Sullivan, who, when he heard that Washington was coming to Boston, thought that what Boston should do was to build a copy of the great Colossus of Rhodes, which was the largest statue, and it was lost, of course, and that this huge statue of Washington, probably 30 or 40 feet high, but with legs spread so that people could walk between the president's legs, would be the appropriate way to welcome George to Boston. Fortunately, that was overruled by the town committee.
Hi, thank you. So it seems to me from a modern sensibility that it does make sense for the president to not stay in a private home and to stay, in a public accommodation. Mm-hmm. However, it seems kind of normal that the visitor would attend a reception held by the host, or was this not really, was Massachusetts not considered a host of the president? Or if you could elaborate a little more on why this was so, because it seems a little bit like President Washington was acting, a little conceited on his part about needing the governor to come to him, but he's a guest in this, I don't know,
Well, I see your question, and it's a fair one. In a battle of egos, no one could beat Hancock, so he did win that one. Washington came out of the decade of the 1780s feeling that the promise of the Revolution was imperiled because of the divisiveness and localism that seemed to be pulling and tearing apart the promise that he had felt that he had seen during the Revolution. He was extremely sensitive about states talking about their own sovereignty, their own independence. He had no sympathy for that. And so if he perhaps did overreact a bit to Hancock, it came from a decade of thinking that in this new country, the president had to trump the local governor. It happened in no other state. In fact, he was, we think of the South, especially South Carolina, as being the hotbed of states' rights. But in fact, his welcome in Charleston was extraordinarily effusive. Perhaps they'd heard about Hancock, I don't know, but he never had this kind of direct confrontation again.
Were there people, governors in the early republic who saw the presidency as more like, say, the Secretary General of the United Nations these days, somebody who's supposed to serve the states and not to govern over the states?
Yeah, there were, and there was debates, theoretical debates, political theory debates about whether our country was a union, a new whole, a new solidarity, or something, a federation like Swiss cantons that were just simply would come together when the country was attacked or something. They tried that during the Confederation, during the 1780s, and I don't know how much all you know about it. It didn't work. It didn't work. And if people like Washington hadn't come forward, supported the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution, it is not beyond our imagination to think that we would have been at least 3 or 4 separate republics. That's just not this historian speaking. If you read Jay's contribution to the Federalist Papers, that's precisely what he warned against. He said, fine, we have 13 now. Do you want like three different countries here? Or do you want a whole that will realize the prospects of this great nation that we brought forward? So, sure, he was sensitive on this issue. Maybe some of you have a higher view of states' rights than I do, but frankly, I think Washington got it right.
Well, certainly the debate about states' rights has continued right up until Texas promised to secede a few years ago. They haven't followed up on that yet. But I guess I have 2 questions. You've talked about how Washington went to the people. Is there a record of the people he actually met in the course of all of these letters and diaries? And how did he balance this desire for the president to be the supreme magistrate of the nation with the fear that had run through all of the debates about the Constitution that the president not become another monarch, not become another royal figure?
Well, I mean, there were a lot of tensions and balances. Washington was a man of great personal pride. He was not an easygoing. He was not a backslapper. As general, certainly he wasn't. He didn't as president. But he did understand the importance of, as I said, of being visible. There was a great debate that was going on during the visit to New England, and that was, what do you call the head of the United States government? And in some innings of this debate, it becomes really hilarious. John Adams, who was vice president, wanted names that would have been really like Gilbert and Sullivan. They were so embarrassing, long-winded and buffoonery. But the people of the United States, who had come of age, most of them, under a monarchy, had trouble with the lexicon of republicanism. And so many of the New England newspapers continued to call him His Majesty. Washington always said, no, I'm the president. I'm not the king. But there was this sense of a transition of political culture that was going on. And I think in part, the purpose of the trip was to bring the people forward to say, we have now a different regime. Say it. I mean, I'm not your king. I'm your president. I'm riding on a horse. The people, there was another tension. Washington set off on the tour when he went to as far as Hartford. And he said, I'm going to dress on this tour in a business suit. And he liked good stuff. There's no question Washington liked good stuff. So he had these wonderful velvet suits and things, and they were beautiful. But the people in Hartford and in Worcester said, we don't want that. I mean, you're the general. You're the greatest hero of the American Revolution. And so by the time he arrived in Boston, he'd put all the business suits aside, and he appeared only as the revolutionary leader. Now, that's direct feedback from the audience. That's not what Washington had planned, but the ordinary. How many ordinary people he met? Of course, he didn't mix with the crowds, but there were huge receptions. And I might say, if you read my wonderful forthcoming book, you're going to find that Washington had a remarkable ability to mix with women. And wherever he went, he had a huge fan clubs of women, and he was one of the greatest, most talented dancers of his generation. And so he would love to dance all night. And it's clear to me that some of the women had more chance to whisper political things in his ears than their ambitious husbands.
A couple of things. First of all, I don't know if you spoke about this already, but was there a legacy when he came to Massachusetts from Shays' Rebellion and his handling of that? I imagine there may have been some bitter feelings among some of the population. And then secondly, of course it didn't turn out this way, but I personally wonder if, would it have really been so bad had there been three countries, which is, to my mind, is related to a question about republic versus empire, and how much of the ambition for union was linked to aspirations for expansion and empire. And It also comes up when people, I mean, I'm not sure how useful it is to think about counterfactuals, but for the sake of it, it comes up later in the discussion about the Civil War, where there were indeed abolitionists who would have argued that the southern states maybe should have been allowed to secede, and there would have been a collapse of slavery in a different way, with not 600,000 dead and a legacy that we still live with today. So I'm wondering about this whole question of maybe smaller, bioregions, ecoregions, might make more sense.
Well, I'm going to, everybody in this room no doubt has their view about how they'd like to answer your second question. I have very strong feelings, but that's politics, not history. So it is true, however, what you've said. Washington had, and many of the founding fathers, including Jefferson, an imperial vision. They thought, they had no doubt that the West would be part of our country long before they'd even explored it. They felt that there was going to be strength in our country that we see as imperial, and it's a very, very sad and disturbing story for all Americans when you realize the Native Americans and others who were steamrolled in this. I understand that. Your first question, I have found not a word, not anything in the tour to indicate an awareness of the Shays. When the Shays revolt took place, I don't know if you know, Washington's immediate response was firmness, restore order. But once the ringleaders were captured, Washington actually urged the people of the administrators in Massachusetts to show mercy and understanding. He was not a hanging judge about that. He wanted social order, but he was not at least in my reading, a mean-spirited man.
You mentioned other founding fathers being more celebrated, John Jay, presumably by the historians
Yes.
rather than the public. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Elaborate on?
On the sense in which others were more celebrated.
Well, John Jay is hardly a household term, I understand. He had a kind of a interesting revolutionary history. He, like some of the founding fathers, came late to the cause, but once he got into it, he served well enough. It's just that I think in the historical textbook world, especially in this period, the standard would be, look, George Washington, as he aged and he became president, was like everybody's nice uncle. He was a nice guy and probably gave candies to the kids and so on. But the real work, the real smart guys were Madison, Hamilton, and Jefferson, who were setting the fiscal future of the country, writing the Constitution, and Madison in Congress, the Bill of Rights, and Jefferson just being a pain in every way. So, and when you read closely their personal life, their family life, their what are revealed in Jefferson's cases, really systematic. Hypocrisy is too strong a word, but it's really it's difficult to work closely with Jefferson and come away with a feeling that he's a person you deeply admire. And I suppose I'm speaking of personal feelings. But as I said, Washington, he made some slips, there's no question. And after the presidency, when the Whiskey Rebellion and something, he did overplay his hand. He got brittle and rigid, and he made some bad choices. I grant you. But at this moment, at the dawn of the new federal government, he was an inspiration.
I'm going to go up and ask another question. So could you elaborate more? I'm a little horrified at the fact that when Washington got to the neck of Boston and the Causeway, that he was not allowed to proceed. I mean, if you could elaborate a little more about what went on there and what was going on, and then also how, what else he did while he was in Boston. Did he just stay the one night and have this standoff, or were there other things going on as well?
Oh, there was a lot going on. Oh. As you all know from your history of Boston, it was then connected by the neck, a little causeway. And what Washington didn't know is that Hancock wanted, as I said, to control the whole show, but the town meeting, which was not in Hancock's pocket, the selectmen of Boston, they had organized this People's Parade of all the workers, organized by trade. It was a wonderful moment in history. And so they said, look, we're in charge. And Hancock's guy said, no, we're in charge. And their coaches, this negotiation was going, here's Washington. He says, I'm cold. And he turns to his secretary. He said, is there any way to get to this town? I mean, is there a back route? And they said, no, actually, that's the point of the causeway, you see. So finally, they broke up. And as the gentleman asked, Bullfinch and Dawes and some of these people who work for the town committee had organized this terrific reception. And the other one said, the day was so terrible. People then they were selling tickets in windows. People were scalping tickets for the Washington Parade, all the stuff, modern stuff. But it rained, and people who stood in the cold so long got. There was an influenza epidemic after, and it was called in the papers the Washington flu. And Washington caught the Washington flu. So one day he was in Boston, he was in bed, and that kept him from doing something that he did later, but he wanted alone to go to Lexington, and just alone, with nobody around him, to pay his homage, as he said, when American blood was first shed. He did it on the return trip. As he came back from New Hampshire, he came back. So, and then there was a paparazzi, who one of the most unaccomplished artists I've ever had the privilege of work with, Gulliker, who in a church started painting Washington's, sitting in a couple of pews, and he couldn't finish, so he chased Washington up to Newburyport, down to Portsmouth, saying, please, just another half hour, please. And that painting, you can see, is in the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I will tell you, whatever it looks like, it does not look like George Washington or an entirely human being. But so there were lots of things going on, and parties and get-togethers. And John Adams felt he was dissed by the whole thing until about the third day, when there was a public meeting, I think in Faneuil Hall, where Sam Adams and John Adams and George Washington appeared, and it really just broke the whole place up, because this was the revolution right before them. And everyone, that was another thing about this trip. People knew that Washington didn't have long. It means he was a link to the greatest event in their lives, and that created an emotional element too.
In Harvard Square, I'm J.L. Bell. Thank you for joining us.
The mainstream media often asks, why did the 9/11 hijackers hate America? News stories describe anti-gay slurs in high school hallways as hate speech. Yet society does not generally define violence against women as motivated by hate. Nor do most people think of New York's, now being re-examined, New York's stop and frisk policing policy overwhelmingly aimed at young men of color as motivated by hate.